Well, how are you doing? This is going to be titled um, Longitude Reassignment. This is the start, the very start of what we've been asked for 8 years probably now at this stage, which is where is your flat Earth map, right? The problem we always had was that here we have the Gleason's map. I'm just going to make it a bit smaller. And what you have on it is the latitude and longitude grid that works absolutely perfect in this format. But you have a situation when it comes to the land masses south of the equator that are stretched out. Like you have Australia that's stretched out here. You have south of the equator of Africa and south of the equator of South America are all stretched and distorted. And maybe even some of the land masses north of the equator, but it's obvious that the south of the equator land masses are distorted. Now, the only reason they're distorted is because the latitude and longitude grid is placed onto a globe. So what happens is the actual sizes of the land masses get distorted when that globe is flattened out. But the reason the latitude and longitude grid works so well on this Gleason's map is because the latitude and longitude grid comes from a flat plane. That's where it's derived from. All the measurements for the latitude and longitude grid all start and end with flat Earth elevation angles to Polaris, which is the exact place where the globe's radius came from, because it was the creation of the latitude and longitude grid via flat Earth elevation angles to Polaris that allowed them to create the latitude and longitude grid, as all the spacings between the latitude rings of latitude along the longitude lines, intersecting the longitude lines, are all directly from flat Earth elevation angles to Polaris, right, with a marine sextant at sea. That's where it all comes from. So they're taking sextant angles between the sea horizon, right, and the visible sea horizon and Polaris. Now, there's two reasons why the latitude and longitude grid have nothing to do with a globe. One is because you couldn't measure it on a globe because it requires a flat plane to measure it, number one, right? Because they required a flat plane for their radius value, which they had to back engineer from, once again, flat Earth elevation angles to Polaris. Because all they actually did was take the longitude lines, any two corresponding longitude lines, and make them meet, which gave them a radius in nautical miles of 3,440, and that then turned into statute miles is 3,856 or 65. Or sorry, let me see, 3,900. So anyway, it's their 3,000. Yeah, sorry, 3,958 and change. That's what it is. I get mixed up between their circumference and their radius. So if you take 3,440 nautical miles and convert it to statute miles, you will have 3,958 point blah blah blah. Right? They rounded off up the way to 3,959. So, but that all comes from the latitude and longitude grid. They couldn't create the radius without the latitude and longitude grid. But to have the latitude and longitude grid in the format it's here now, then it had to be shown to be in this format. It had to be measured, right, and created from flat Earth elevation angles to Polaris, which gave them everything from the GP point of Polaris to the equator. And then they just extended it, right, after that, all south. So everywhere, so they had 90 at GP point of Polaris to the equator, which is 0, and then they just added another 90 out in all directions. So they have 0 here and then back to 90 south. But it wasn't until after all that before they could really take two longitude lines then and make a ball out of it, a circle out of it, and then make a ball out of the rest of it. Because that's all the globe is an orthographic circle. That's all it is. An orthographic circle that they that they claim turned into an internal 3D dimensional ball. It's like none of this none of their maths is possible without the flat plane to measure everything off, because they can't measure angles off of the curved surface they have within their model. They can't do that. Everything, all the radius, every part of the globe comes from a flat plane. But what they did, not to be too long-winded with it, what they did is when they took all the longitude lines and made them meet at a geographic south pole position on their globe, what that did is when they flattened it all back out again, right? Once they did that, they placed all the land masses south of the equator, like Australia here, onto their as their actual size on the globe. So it allowed them to shrink the oceans between, like, Australia, South Africa, South America, and Australia, right? They allowed them to shrink all the oceans, but when they flattened out the whole thing, it then stretched back out the oceans, but also stretched the land masses. So what's really going on here is they reassigned the latitude and longitude positions of these places by doing what they did. So this is why I'm calling this longitude reassignment, right? So there's a second reason why they can't do any measurements to Polaris for any reason, besides the fact that they can't measure an elevation angle off of a curved surface, right? That they have it in a model. The second problem they have is that their horizon is always refracted. So any measurement that they get between their visible horizon, not the reality visible horizon, but their visibility horizon and Polaris, will never match the latitude and longitude grid, because their visible horizon is always refracted at a rate of at least 7/6, which changes their radius from 3,959 miles to 4,618 miles. Right? So they are always working with a radius that is at least that size and bigger, right? So they can never make those measurements. They don't have the flat plane to begin with, and secondly, their horizon, right? All the measurements when they make a ball out of the latitude and longitude grid, every point on that has to match Polaris. But in reality, within their model, because it's always refracted, the horizon will never match what they need it to match. So their refracted horizons will never match the latitude and longitude grid, making it not just impossible, even if they had a globe and that was the situation, the latitude and longitude grid could not exist, because there would be no consistency, because their horizon is constantly refracted at all these different rates of claims of rates or whatever. So it can't work. Now, I will put a video in the description here of this video, a 40-minute video on where they got the radius from, and then another video on why their 7/6R horizon makes it impossible for the latitude and longitude grid, and especially any observations to Polaris, to ever work within our model, right? Completely taking our model out. But this is about the starting of the creation of a flat Earth map, right? This is the very beginning of it. If you want a flat Earth map, this is the very beginning of it. Because, as I said earlier, the latitude and longitude grid is purely a flat Earth grid. That's what it is. It's derived from measurements taken off a flat plane. That's the only way you can derive it. But, as I said, places like Australia have been stretched out. So here we have, right, these two black lines. This one here is representing, let's say, the longitude line that's running through Sydney, and this one here is representing the longitude line that's running through Perth. But the red line here would be the actual longitude line of Perth, because you have to remember this is stretched out, right? So the actual distance between Sydney here and Perth would actually be between this black line and this red line, not this black line and this black line, because that is a stretched out Australia. In reality, Australia is not that wide. But what they did is by making a sphere out of the latitude and longitude grid, they also reassigned all the longitude lines south of the equator, if not some north of the equator, but all the longitude and latitude positions are basically reassigned outside of their reality. So I'll show you what I mean now. So longitude reassignment, right? Sydney is 151 degrees east longitude. So we'll hold Sydney constant for this, right? I don't know if when we go further with this, right, in time, if Sydney will be held constant, but because the latitude and longitude grid, just to show you, sorry, right, the latitude and longitude grid is red, east to west, right? So you have east and west in the latitude because you have from the prime meridian, east and west, right? So you have, we're talking about east here, we're talking about 151 and 115 degrees east longitude. You also have west longitude, but it's an azimuthal, right? This is another reason why none of this can work on a globe. This is based on an azimuthal reading. So it's always going to be around in clockwise motion, right? Basically, right? So that's another thing about the latitude and longitude grid. Because it's red flat, it has to be flat. The whole lot has to be flat. It's measured flat. It only exists due to flat Earth measurements. The whole thing works flat. So the only thing that doesn't work is by placing it onto a globe. That only skews everything up. But the point I'm making is it works in a circle, right? The longitude lines are all measured in a circular fashion, right? So from the prime meridian, they're measured east and west, right, in a circular fashion. So let's just say we're going to hold Sydney constant for this, right? So Sydney is 115 degrees east longitude. That's the longitude it's given at present. Perth is given 115 degrees east longitude, right? An airline distance between Sydney and Perth is 2,044 statute miles. 2,044 statute miles equals 1,776 nautical miles. 1,776 nautical miles divided by 60, which would be 60 minutes per degree, equals 29.6. 151 minus 29.6 equals 121.4. So this means that if we hold Sydney's longitude constant and use the real world distance between Sydney and Perth, then that places Perth at around 121 degrees east longitude and not 115 degrees east longitude. This is how the trick was done. So in reality, right, Perth is more 121 degrees east longitude and not 115 degrees. Right? And this is how the trick was done. So if we hold Sydney constant, right, because we're reading it that way, that's how the latitude and longitude, that's how you read in azimuth. You would hold Sydney constant and read it around in that direction. That would place Perth at 121 degrees, because that's how it works out mathematically based on the distances between the two places, the two locations. So really what happened is there was a reassignment of the longitude lines when they created a globe out of the latitude and longitude grid. But the latitude and longitude grid only exists, right, because it was measured off a flat plane. It requires a flat plane to do the measurement. So if anyone wants to know about a flat Earth map, not that I'm going to create the whole flat Earth map, but this is the very beginning of it. For that to happen, there needs to be a reassignment for all the latitude and longitude positions of at least south of the equator, because the further south you go, the more skewed they get. Only because they made a globe out of the latitude and longitude grid, something that could never be created if we lived on a globe, because you can't create that off a globe. It requires elevation angles to Polaris, which you can't have, and it requires an horizon that's an optical location, but not something that's refracted all over the place. You can't use that. You can't use a refracted horizon to get your correct latitude with Polaris. You can't do that. It's total nonsense. So their globe was built off of a flat Earth, and all they did is they hijacked our latitude and longitude grid and made a sphere out of it, and then flattened the whole thing out again and stretched out everywhere south of the equator, and started saying, see, nothing works. It doesn't work because you have already mutated it. We have to now unmutate it That's what has to happen. So everywhere south of the equator must be unmutated and given its correct longitude, latitude and longitude positions. So Australia doesn't change in size. It only changes in size on this map because it's too big. You bring it back to its actual size. Everywhere south of the equator is bringing it back to their actual size, right? But the oceans are kept at the same size. That's the only thing that's the only difference between. That's the only thing that's not working is the fact that due to them making a globe out of latitude and longitude grid, they've stretched out when they flattened it a whole lot out. They stretch out everywhere south of the equator. But in reality, that's not the situation. All these places are the sizes they actually are, and the oceans are bigger. That's what actually is going on. So that's how they made the ocean smaller, was by making a globe out of latitude and longitude grid, which made the whole of the Earth smaller in total area. But we know circles of equal latitude, for example, can be measured to a point that way bigger than what the surface of the globe Earth can hold. There's no way out of it. So this is the start of, anyone wants to know about a flat Earth map, that's the very start of it. The longitudinal reassignment, and maybe the latitude as well, reassignment. But let's start off with longitudinal reassignment, because we work in a circle in that situation. Now, I'm sure I'll get a lot of backlash for this. As I said, I'll place those two videos in the description. Watch them if you're new to this and you're confused by anything. This is a bit far ahead for a lot of people who might just be purely getting into this topic. But this is what needs to happen. Because we need to have this map, but with everywhere south of the equator in its correct size. And all that means is that a reassignment of their latitude and longitude positions. We don't need to change reality. We just need to go back to reality. This was a change in reality. That's the problem. The globe was a change in reality. We need to go back to reality, not change it. We need to change from fantasy, which is what we've been led to believe we are living in and on for far too long. Thanks for watching.